I am now delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for today, who has travelled all the way from Australia to be with us, overcoming a litany of challenges and delays that I think would have made much lesser people turn on their heel and head home. So really appreciate her commitment to being here with us today. Dr. Joanna is a Senior Research Fellow at Cradle, which is the Centre for Research and Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University in Australia. Her research and assessment focuses on inclusion and diversity, feedback literacies, developing evaluative judgment, and student experiences across university and workplace. She's currently undertaking funded projects on feedback literacy and inclusive assessment. She is a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a member of the Australian and New Zealand Association for Health Professionals Education and the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction. Welcome, Joanna.
Hi everyone, and thanks for having me here. It was, as Roisin said, a little bit of a tumultuous trip with flight cancellations, floods in Dubai, but I made it in good time. And so happy to be here, and thank you to QQI and Ahead for inviting me. When I started work on assessment for inclusion, I thought it was kind of like a little side project that was away from some of the other work that I was doing, and I didn't realise exactly how important it was. And so to be in a room full of people who are interested on this topic is just amazing. Now let's see if I can make the thing do the thing. Excellent. And I would like to acknowledge firstly that in Australia, we are not the first people in the country, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, acknowledging that education and learning has gone on in an inclusive way for many, many thousands of years, and hopefully what we do now is also continuing that tradition. Also colleagues at Cradle, because I have not done this work alone, and also to participants in all of my research projects and workshops and other events, so students, academics, accessibility practitioners and others, because without everyone's experiences, I would not have anything to talk about today. So my talk will be in approximately 3 parts. I'd like to set the scene a little bit, but I am aware that this morning already has had many contributions on this front. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about our ideas around what we could aim for in assessment for inclusion. And then I'd also like to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty in how we might get there. But I thought I'd begin with a little quote, and I will read this one out aloud. Higher education assessment is changing because the needs of higher education are changing. These needs are changing because technology is dramatically transforming not only modes of assessment, but also modes of learning and problem solving. The overarching concerns for equity in education and fairness in assessment become paramount in this era of societal flux, especially as they intersect with issues of access, equality, diversity, and accountability in higher education. Now, I'd like to invite any guesses as to when this quote was written and published. And people who have seen the slides before can't answer this question, but I like to invite any other suggestions from the audience. And you can yell out and I will repeat the number. 1960. Okay, any other takers? 2000? Late 90s? 1980. Wow. You've got some people who are in the right ballpark. So this is Samuel Messick, one of the great people in the validity side of assessment, who wrote a book in 1998 about assessment and inclusion. So we're here today, and we have a great opportunity to talk about these things. I'd like to recognise that we're part of a bigger conversation that has been going on for some time, and it's really interesting to think about what has changed and what hasn't changed, and how we actually need to get change to happen. Now, last bit of last bit of audience participation before you can sit back and relax. What are your hopes for inclusive assessment? Where do you hope to go? And I'm really interested also because, we've got conversations going on in Australia, but it's a really great opportunity to interact with people on the other side of the world. And acknowledging that we have heard just the magic wand things just before, but are there any further hopes?
More choice.
More choice. Better experience for students or staff? Both. Excellent.
An option for everyone that nobody thinks it's not for me.
An option for everyone, so nobody thinks it's not for me. Flexibility. These are all excellent ideas. And hopefully we can come to some of these things today. How to get there. So a little bit taking a step back to think about assessment, and I think it was already acknowledged this morning that assessment has multiple purposes. And my colleague and boss, David Bowd, has been talking about the multiple purposes of assessment for some time. QQI obviously has a great interest in assessment of learning, that certification aspect to ensure that learning outcomes are met and that the students we graduate actually can do the things we say they can do. There's also assessment for learning, and this is the bit that I guess I'm quite interested in, about how students learn through assessment, and that assessment needs to develop students' capabilities rather than just being that certification aspect. And there's been a lot of arguments recently about assessment as learning, and they link in with ideas about sustainability, that through assessment students do learn. But we should also make sure that the assessment doesn't prevent students from doing things beyond the current task. There will be a time when they don't have teachers and assessors anymore. They need to go out into the world and to know whether they've actually done a good job or not by themselves. And this is something that we need to ensure that assessment supports students to do. Assessment is also incredibly influential. And again, my boss wrote a fair while ago now, students can, with difficulty, escape the effects of poor teaching. They cannot, by definition, if they want to graduate, escape the effects of poor assessment. Biggs also talked about this in terms of the backwash effect, the unintentional things that might happen when you design an assessment in a particular way, what students actually get out of an assessment, what students are required to do as part of the assessment, and these might not be the things that we intend assessment to do. So when we think about what we're doing in assessment, we also have to be mindful of all the pitfalls that might arise. It's also a good reminder to think about obligations in assessment. And I think this is something that perhaps educators, especially those who aren't particularly trained in education and are trying to do their research job as well as teaching students, perhaps aren't so familiar with perhaps the legal obligations, and there is a lot of legal obligations, and I had a brief look at the Irish legislation. It looks a little bit different from the Australian stuff, but I think the important thing is that there is an expectation for students with various disabilities, with different ways of learning, to be included and to be supported, and that we also need to ensure that assessment supports these students to demonstrate their capabilities. So it is actually a legal requirement, and it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes you can get legal challenges which everyone would prefer to avoid. But beyond the legal, there are also ethical and moral things that we are doing with our students when we think about assessment. And my colleague Rola Ajawi has written a little bit about how failure impacts students and how if our assessments aren't set up in the right way, this really impacts how students experience higher education and has actual implications for what they choose to go on to do. And students are very persistent overall, but if assessment is the thing that is not inclusive and gets them down, then this has implications for their entire life. Jan MacArthur also talks about assessment being, an inclusive assessment being more than just making sure students get the right mark. It's more than just that baseline level of fairness. It's about how we support students to do well and to think about how those students are going to make a contribution to the world beyond their university degree. So why should we be concerned about inclusion and assessment? And thank you everyone this morning for already making this point for me. We know that adjustments, reasonable accommodations, whatever they might be called, don't actually fully meet student needs, and we heard that just before on the student panel as well. And we've known this for a long time. Waterfield and West, in their report from 2006, talked about students' experiences, and they surveyed those who had special arrangements. While 67% of students were satisfied, 18% were not, and another 14% weren't even sure. And this suggests that, if a third of students aren't feeling that the accommodations are working for them, even when they're provided, that's not a good start. Others in the US did do a little bit of an experiment as well. They offered students with ADHD or learning disabilities a separate room for exams, and that didn't actually result in them performing any better. And I think Joseph just before perhaps identified some reasons about problems with different rooms, in that they aren't actually always very good. But there's a lot of work there to suggest that the way that we are currently doing things doesn't work out. We also know that students don't actually want to declare that they are different from everybody else. And Susan Grimes has done a series of papers on this in Australia, and she found that of approximately 2,000 students that she surveyed, there were a proportion that said that they did have some kind of condition that impacted on their learning at university. And of those students with a diagnosis, almost 50% didn't disclose their condition because of a whole range of various reasons, including feeling ashamed, not thinking that they would actually get anything useful out of an accommodation, and just thinking that the paperwork is too hard. The onus of proof on students that paperwork was too difficult to grapple with. So students are reporting that they have impacts on assessment, and I'd suggest that there are a hidden population out there that we don't even know about. And similar to the previous presentations on how student numbers are increasing and numbers of students with disabilities within higher education are increasing, the same thing is happening in Australia. So we've noticed across a number of years, and that big, thick, dotted blue line in the bottom third of the graph shows a steady increase in the number of students with a disability participating in higher education. And even if that number, the proportion isn't increasing as a proportion of students overall, in sheer numbers we are seeing more and more of these students. And while we're here today talking and focusing mainly on various forms of disability, I'd also like to encourage you all to think about diversity more broadly, thinking about not just background characteristics that students come in with, but also where they're planning to go, what their learning goals and interests are, and where they think they're going to go beyond education. And this is important in thinking about what we need assessment to do for students. So is assessment an inclusive experience? I think we've heard some yes, some no so far. And this matches with research I've done with students in Australia. So we found that positive relationships with faculty and support staff were really important for students to feel included. We found that spaces and the timing of in-person assessment was really important, especially for students with physical disability or medical conditions. So having to go to an exam venue and working out, is there a ramp that I can get up? Is there a lift? Is my room really far from the toilets because I might need to go to the toilet more frequently? All of these things added the level of stress for in-person exams. For students who needed support to get to the exam venue, there was another level of intricacy around the timing of exams. If they're required to turn up earlier because they need to make sure they need to report to a special person to ensure that they've got the laptop that meets their learning needs set up. There was one student who turned up one day and found that the laptop was not there. And so she had to go all the way home, which was a couple of hours away because she was from a regional centre, and email people and try and work it out for another day. It's incredibly stressful and isn't very inclusive. We did this study in the context of COVID, and you might know that Australia, and particularly Melbourne, had a lot of lockdowns and people weren't allowed to leave their homes, so we had a lot of switch to online exams. In this setting, technology was helpful for students with disabilities, but not always. Some of them had issues with internet connection and speed, which were totally unrelated to their learning condition, but had a significant impact on how they were able to participate in assessment. One student also had a huge issue with screen reader incompatibility when the institution chose a particular exam platform. And so those choices at that bigger level of what happens in assessment also really matter for students. And finally, we've also already heard a lot about how the task requirements, things like having to do a lot of recall from memory, had implications for those with fatigue and learning differences. And yeah, these aren't new problems. So I said Messick wrote that book on assessment in higher education in 1998. Colleagues Mike Adams and Sally Brown in 2006 wrote an edited collection on towards inclusive learning in higher education. And Cheryl Bergstahler edited the second edition of Universal Design in Higher Education in 2015. So these are conversations that have been going on for a while, but things don't feel like they've changed. And so we thought perhaps we would need a different way of thinking about this problem. And we suggested that instead of thinking about inclusive assessment, we might also think about assessment for inclusion. And we come at this from the perspective that that problems that mean that assessment is not inclusive are impactful for good assessment design. It's not just about ensuring that students are included. Actually, it's more than that. It's about ensuring that the assessment is good. And so we've got this definition. Assessment should recognise diversity in student learning and endeavour to ensure that no student is discriminated against by virtue of features other than their ability to meet appropriate standards. This goes along with what Kevin Merry was saying earlier about irrelevant constructs. And while we are thinking about this in terms of today, students with disability, we're trying to extend that thinking about what diversity might be and how that interacts with assessment beyond those things to think about that bigger picture and about assessment that serves everyone. So why do we need to shift our perspective? One of my good colleagues, Molly Dollinger, has written a paper discussing the biopsychosocial model and linking it particularly to graduate employability. But in that paper, she does say that the medical model of disability is incredibly flawed. We can't think about it as a problem that exists within individuals and that we're just trying to fix things for those students. We need to recognise that it is about the environment that they live in, the biopsychosocial factors which contribute to individuals' capability and their disadvantage within higher education. So thinking beyond just a particular diagnosis to what's happening in the situation, what works and doesn't work for those students. And she even goes as far to say that reasonable adjustments are ableist. And I'd suggest for that reason alone, we should probably think about not using reasonable adjustments so much and changing assessment to be different. Jan MacArthur also talks about assessment for social justice and inclusive assessment. And she argues that frequently we focus only on the procedural aspects of fairness. Is there a process that students can go through so that they can have a fair assessment? This doesn't actually change what's going on with the assessment task itself. We don't question, is that assessment a good assessment? Does it do the things that we need it to do? Thinking about all those different purposes of assessment. And she suggests that the lived experience and outcomes for students are entirely ignored when we focus only on the procedures. And again, this slide is practically redundant because we also heard earlier that there's been an increase in access plans here. I did look at the access plans at my institution back in 2000. I analysed 2,860 of them with some help. And we found that students with access plans only made up 4.7% of our student population, And this was a lower number than the number of students we know had ticked a box on enrolment to say that they had some kind of condition. And that again is lower than the known rate of disability in the Australian population. So we've got the same kind of issues around not being able to address and meet the needs of all the students who might be out there with various conditions, because we just don't know that they exist and they don't want to say to us that they exist. And big shout out that exams did contribute to the by far the largest amount of access plans, and other forms of assessment were less problematic. So yeah, let's try and get away from exams. So how can we move towards assessment for inclusion? And I was thinking about this. There are really approximately 3 levels that we can tackle this on. First, we can think about the student experience and how we change what happens in the student experience. This is, of course, linked with assessment and course design, that sort of middle level, where we're thinking about how we can change what happens in assessment, which requires educators, academics to be involved. Then we can think about leadership and policy, and hopefully that's something that happens today. I think it's coming later on, and I'm really excited to find out what's going to happen here. So I'll talk a little bit more about these 3 levels. Starting off at the grassroots with students. And we did do some work around, we spent some time with students, approximately 60 students over a number of workshops, asking them, you know, what should we do? What should teachers consider when designing or implementing inclusive assessment? And these were all things linked back to authenticity, which was mentioned earlier today by Joanna as one of the key things that should help. And so students said things like, be passionate in what they, the academics, do, and be interested in having a real dialogue with students. And students really found that if they were able to see that somebody else was interested in the topic, in how the assessment was going to unfold, that really motivated them to also to put in effort. Students also said, you know, have relatable assignments that students can connect to. So how students see themselves in relation to the assessment task. Someone suggested avoid making the assignment too narrow so students can't put any of their own views into it. I think this relates back to choice and flexibility as well in thinking about constructing an assessment. And finally, have them be more applicable for our future careers. So have more realistic assignments, which are things we would be expected to do in jobs. And so when you think about these kinds of suggestions, they're not like mind-blowing. They're not like change everything ever. They're not just, you know, toss out what you've got and start again. Students really value these incremental kinds of things that we can actually do, I think, reasonably easily. They're not saying actually entirely get rid of exams, even though that's something I would suggest is important. They're actually saying, you know, we'd like just a little bit more connection to the task. So I think that's really interesting from the perspective of what we might think about design. And colleagues have argued that assessment is more than just the task. So Margaret Bierman and others did a huge project in Australia around assessment design decisions where they asked academics, you know, how do you design assessment? What goes in to an assessment design? And they come up with this little circle in the middle here, which has 6 categories. And so when we match this against what students are thinking about and suggesting for inclusive assessment, we can start off with things around the interactions that happen in assessment. So with academic staff, how students might interact with their peers and feel included by their peers. Also about student support services and how those interactions happen in time and space. I know Dara was saying this morning, you know, it's those crunch periods where the assessment happens and everybody's working so hard. You know, how can we think about spreading this out over time? How do students know that the support services are there at the times that they need them? We think about learner outcomes and diverse learner futures. So when we're designing the assessment task, what does that look like? How can we support that diversity? In the task itself, and Kevin this morning really criticised assessment instructions and information, and that has also been something that has come through our work, that students find it really problematic with all the jargon, with the assumptions about what they are meant to know before they approach the assessment task. And also the timing of assessments. Some of the students really said, look, I'm studying full time, I've got 4 subjects, and all of them set their assessment due date on the same day. So I'm scrambling. I've got 4 things to manage at once, and that's really hard when I've got a particular medical condition, which means that I can't work at the same capacity as other people. But even students without particular learning needs, disabilities, find that timing thing a real problem. So things that we do for the sake of inclusion might actually help everyone. We can also think about the purposes of assessment in terms of learning goals, but also thinking about the program, the location of the assessment task within the course. Is this assessment trying to support students in their first year to get a feel for what university assessments are like? Or is it at the end of the course where we really have to make sure that students have learnt at a high level the things that we say that they are meant to be able to do as part of a particular degree? And that might influence the way that we think about the assessment design. We can also think about the context, assessment emotions. So students really said that assessment was an emotional experience. And it is for all students, but we know that there are students with mental health conditions for whom that this is further elevated, and this definitely impacts on their experience of assessment. Within that contextual setting, we can also think about equitable assessment, access to resources for assessment. And so this might be things like, can you get to the library to get to the resources? Are the resources available online? Do you need a particular type of computer to edit a podcast or a video? How can we ensure that there is equitable access to these things when we're designing assessment tasks? And does everybody have the same level of capability with the things that are extraneous to the particular capabilities we're trying to assess in assessment, in the assessment task? And finally, one thing that students really valued was the opportunities for learning through assessment. So those feedback processes, what can we do there to make them more inclusive? And I've got a little bit more on that soon. So let's think about that course level, about thinking about course design, assessment design for inclusion. And by talking to educators, we've really realised that this is an ongoing process. We worked with people across a semester, and it was an iterative process. The things that you try at first might not work exactly the way you imagined that they were going to work, and so you have to make a change again. And this is a common thing across assessment design, that it's not going to be fixed in one go-round. We have to think about that ongoing process, and it does involve many people coordinating, and a lot of, in Australia, we do a lot of teaching in teams, so it's not just one person who designs the assessment. There could be a team of people working on the assessment. But then we also need to think about the students, about policy, about all those interactions. So a couple of years ago now, we wrote a paper thinking conceptually about strategies for inclusive assessment design, authenticity, programmatic assessment, and assessment for distinctiveness. And I'll just run through these briefly. So firstly, thinking about authenticity in assessment. And I think a big takeaway here is that authenticity is different for different people. And while we might be able to design authenticity into an assessment task, there is also what happens in learning time when students get a hold of that task and do and interpret it the way that they see it. We can't fully control that as educators, but we can create conditions that support authenticity. And we can think about authenticity in a number of different ways. It doesn't always have to be the same type of authenticity. And so it could be the way that people perceive it in themselves. So we might think about integrating students' values, their capabilities, and their future aspirations, and that is one take on authenticity. We can also think about the task itself, and think about expectations about acceptable support or restrictions when completing work. And one quote from one of the studies that stands out to me is that a student said, "Look, I'm studying law. I would never be expected to complete a brief in 2 hours without consulting any resources. I would be using a computer, and I would be, consulting consulting a whole range of sources, and this would happen over time. So a written exam is completely inauthentic to what I'm going to be doing in the real world, and I know that the real world setting is something that I want to look at and participate in. And so why can't the assessment be more like that? And yeah, she pointed it out, and I was like, yeah, why wouldn't we do it in a way that's authentic to future tasks? And finally, we might think about authenticity in terms of values. And if inclusion is a value, then involving diverse students in assessment design to make it authentic in that sense. So, programmatic assessment. And some of my colleagues at Deakin prefer the term course-wide assessment because programmatic assessment has a particular meaning in the health professions world where everything is involved, when that is less possible in situations where perhaps you've got a liberal arts degree and not everything follows on neatly from one level to the next. But taking that program level perspective on the required learning outcomes means that not everything has to be assessed at every occasion. If we are expecting students to have some degree of writing communication and some degree of oral communication, but also have disciplined knowledge and be able to do particular tasks, not all of these have to be assessed in the one assessment task. We can ensure that across the whole program that these things happen, consider how these tasks are linked or related over time, and when we're thinking about that bigger picture, we can also begin to support students to have those capabilities. Rather than just expecting it to happen from day one, we might say, this is a first-year task. We're not expecting the same thing as we're expecting of them when they finish their degree. So changing the assessment to suit and to be part of that bigger program might be a way to be more inclusive and being explicit about how it all works together. Finally, another idea is around assessment for distinctiveness. We're not expecting cookie-cutter graduates who all look the same, who all have the exact same capabilities at the end. We know that graduates are going to different places, to different jobs. They might be choosing to study a further degree. So why should we be thinking about assessment as preparing everyone for the exact same things? This means that open-ended tasks are really important. They could support students to develop those distinct capabilities in a trajectory that suits them. And again, offering these variety of ways to demonstrate learning and capability aligns with UDL. So why shouldn't we be doing it? Finally, getting to that leadership level. And this is something that I'm only starting to come to now because there were so many juicy issues at that with student experiences and assessment design. But in our work with educators, there has been a lot of talk around the conflict of inclusion with things like upholding academic standards, around concerns with academic integrity, and meeting industry accreditation requirements. We had so many people say, oh, but my course is accredited, and that means I can't change the assessment. That's not actually the right approach, because we know during COVID, accreditors were very happy to have assessment outcomes met in different ways. And they would also be incredibly happy to know, beyond just essays, that students can actually do the things that they are required. I also ran a workshop earlier this year at a health professions assessment conference. It was a small group, and I asked, does your institution have a policy on inclusion in assessment? And while 9 people said yes, 6 said no, and 2 said, dunno. And this was pretty incredible to me. I thought, I just kind of assumed that everyone was on the same track as Deakin, and the bottom screenshot there is of Deakin's assessment procedure, which is the thing that sits under the policy, and it actually says assessment must be inclusive and reflect Deakin's diverse community. And this happened pretty quickly. I was starting to get involved in research in 2020 and 2021. I had a baby in 2022. That was the year I took some leave. I came back, and this was the new policy. It was like less than a year, and it changed to be inclusive. So that was really lovely. So it is possible to just do the policy change like that. The other thing I wanted to mention was feedback. Feedback is often considered in relation to assessment. And when I was reflecting on it, I haven't actually done any particular work on feedback for inclusion yet. But I was thinking about the principles of feedback as set out by colleagues and this sort of new paradigm feedback that has been around for about 10 years now, where we consider feedback as a process involving the active engagement of students and others. And this student-focused approach, I think, is firstly inclusive. This kind of approach also therefore requires us to promote students' capability to engage in feedback, commonly called student feedback literacy. And so taking this approach of, well, we actually need to teach students about feedback and how to engage in feedback, I think is part of being inclusive. And finally, recognising the possibilities of different modes and processes for feedback is probably going to be really important. And so colleagues have done a lot of work around video feedback, around screencast feedback. I'd suggest that these are ways that can be more inclusive in terms of offering those multiple modes of communication. We can also think about design in feedback, so things like cover sheets, asking students to declare what their goals and interests are and what they would like feedback on. If they know that if that particular things are not interesting to them to develop, then we should be not just giving feedback on spelling and grammar because that's easy. We should focus on the things that students actually want to hear about, to develop, so that they can go on and do better work the next time round. And there's a comic there on the page that just talks about the old days of feedback where we just fired off some comments at students and said, yeah, well, that's good. That's not what we're talking about. That's not inclusive. So, what do we do now? When I thought about this, I was like, the opportunities are endless. And we frequently divide this into practice and research. But I think actually practice informs what is important to research, and hopefully research also informs what we do in practice. So when we think about what we could do, we could be thinking about tomorrow, like what could we do tomorrow when we go back to our regular jobs? What could we do next semester, the next time we offer a subject? What happens in a year's time, and what are those bigger goals further down the track? We can also think about practice from an individual perspective. You know, how as educators or people who work with students, you know, what is it that we can do individually around understanding, around empathy in our interactions? What should we talk about with our teams about inclusion? What's happening at the institutional level? Where is the conversation at? How can we influence that? What can we do across a sector? And what's happening internationally? We also might think about who we're targeting. Is it students directly? Are we talking to academics? Are we talking across systems? Are we interacting with industry and trying to work with industry on how we can be more inclusive together? And accreditation bodies. I haven't yet managed to crack that one, but I'd really love to talk to accreditation bodies, particularly in the health professions, about what things are inclusive and what aren't, and how we can solve things there. And on the research side, I've never written a paper that said, we've solved the problem, it's all good, we don't need any further research. There's always more research that could be done. And I was talking to Alexa earlier and saying, you know, it is really about collecting diverse students' experiences of assessment and turning it into published research so that we can say, look, this is published in the literature, that this doesn't work, we've got to do something different. We can also look at how technology can make a difference to inclusion. Thanks, Joanna. Thinking about the validity of assessment designs, so really taking that perspective that it's not just about being inclusive for students, but it's actually about the problems with accreditation, with certification, making sure that we can actually say, hand on heart, these students can do the things we say they can. And we should also really be thinking not just about changing things, but understanding the impact of those changes. What happens when we change assessment and feedback? How does that change student experience? Does it actually make a difference to student success? And which students does it work for? Which ones doesn't it work for? So coming back to the title of my talk, how can we head in the same direction? And we're here today. I think it's amazing that we're all in the room to be able to collaborate, to agree on a destination. We also need to value diversity in what we're doing and recognise that there are perhaps multiple routes to get to the same kind of destination, that it's not just one thing that's going to solve all the problems, but we have to do a lot of different things. And finally, I think monitoring progress is really important. We need to identify when there is too much tension and we're working at cross purposes, and to take a step back and think about what can we do that addresses everyone's concerns. So, if I had some takeaway messages, and I know there's a lot of writing on this slide. Firstly, that assessment for inclusion is a perpetual endeavour requiring robust conversation. It's not going to be just one conference, one event that fixes things. We need to continually work at this. And I think, supporting inclusion is a worthy goal. And every time we work at this, we're going to find that there's another group of students that aren't quite included the way that we would like them to be. We're never going to solve the problem, but every step that we take towards that goal is important. We need to remember that the problems with poor assessment design are amplified for diverse students, and that we need to, first and foremost, be thinking about where is the assessment design not good enough. We also need to steer away from that deficit discourse to consider how students can demonstrate capabilities in various ways. And this is important not just for inclusion, but also for validity. And that might be something that convinces people who aren't so interested in inclusion, although they wouldn't be in this room, but something to take away. Assessment design also always involves compromise. We're never going to get to that perfect assessment that does everything right. Equally, our choices in what we do in assessment are never neutral. They will always include and exclude particular people, and we might never get to the point where we can include everyone through one task. So unfortunately, while it would be great to get rid of reasonable adjustments entirely, that's probably not going to be possible. But there are so many things that we can do in assessment design that would include more people. And finally, each of us can contribute to this aspiration of assessment for inclusion. At all levels, there's a role for us all, and we can all do little things and bigger things that will contribute to this. And so, again, it's just really great to be here today, to be amongst people who are like-minded. And yeah, I would really value your thoughts and barriers that you identify that exist. So that's the end of my talking. I've got a ridiculous reference list that no one can see, but I do believe the slides will be distributed, so that's not a problem. Cradle, where I work, also has a great range of resources around assessment design to support inclusion, but also academic integrity, all those other things. The QR code takes you to the resources and publications page, and my email address is also there in case you want to email me something separately. So thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
So thank you, that was fabulous, Joanna, and I suppose really inspirational and useful, particularly I think at the different levels of action, and I think action is, I suppose, where we want to go with this. It is a perpetual endeavour, but each of us are in different places in the system, and it's useful for each of us to think about our own role and what it is we can do to contribute to moving the dial on this. I would like to invite now any questions anyone has for Joanna. I might start maybe with Slido, Erica, if there's anything coming through there.
There's a few actually really good and really engaging questions coming through in the Slido throughout the whole day, but particularly in this session. And this one's got a few thumbs up, so I think it resonates with a few people. And it's this person is saying, sometimes the way that standards are expressed can create barriers to inclusion in assessment. So do you think work needs to be done in this space?
100%. The worst learning outcome that I have encountered recently was something like, students should be able to write an essay on the topic of, insert topic here, as one of the learning outcomes. Like literally, you need to write an essay on this topic as the learning outcome. And so we were talking to this person about, can you change your assessment to be more inclusive? And he's like, literally my learning outcome, which I cannot change because I just got given this unit to teach, literally says write an essay. And we're like, oh my gosh, yes. So like if the learning outcomes aren't appropriately phrased, if the standards focus on things that are kind of irrelevant to the underlying stuff that we should be actually getting students to demonstrate, then yeah, we need to focus on that. And I think that goes back to that, the argument that we do need to have some kind of education. I'm not going to say training. Well, training is a terrible word. We do need to teach people how to write learning outcomes, how to think about constructive alignment in setting learning activities, in setting outcomes, in setting the assessment. Like this, as someone who has done a PhD in education and has studied this stuff, and I've also done the grad cert, which I think is a grad cert in higher education, which actually focuses on these things. I'm like, how do people have not encountered these things? But obviously, there's a whole bunch of academics who are in academia because they are research experts, but how do we also support their education expertise in a way that is just in time, that works for them, that aligns with their motivations for what they're doing in teaching? So, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. I think that covers it pretty well. Another one here is, what have you encountered as the biggest challenges for educators implementing assessment for inclusion strategies, and how can institutions help?
Yeah, so the work that I've done has been very fortunate to have like funding attached, so like little incentives for educators to get involved. We've really had a lot of opportunities to interact and support them through the thinking process, the learning process, because I think if it's something that you haven't thought about before, realising that your assessment isn't actually inclusive and doesn't actually meet the needs of all your students is actually a little bit scary, and you feel bad about it. So having support there to help educators work through that process is really important. And we're super fortunate at Deakin University, where I am, to have a large team of learning designers, of academic developers, of people who will work with you with the technology to design the stuff that works well. So support is really important.
Yeah, 100%. It's so much easier when everyone's kind of on the same page and is on board with you. Even if it's not financial support, just kind of mental support is another big part of it, totally. Just a couple more here. Might actually take one in person if anyone's around.
Hi, Joanna. Thanks for your talk. I really like the whole idea of the social justice perspective there and John MacArthur's work. Can you kind of expand on how the social justice perspective could be inculcated into the assessment system? Just curious.
Yeah, so when Jan MacArthur talks about the social justice side of things, she is talking a lot about how to support students so that they go out into the world and do good things, and to think about social justice in the sense of underrepresented groups, to think about how they can be supported in different ways. I think that the thing about assessment is that assessment is designed by educators who are academics. These academics have done well in the systems that already exist. They've done well at writing long essays despite, crappy handwriting or whatever else. And so a lot of what assessment design looks like at the moment is really, oh, well, I did this previously, it worked okay for me, so presumably it's going to work okay for my students. But that really perpetuates this model of a particular model of assessment, which doesn't suit everyone. Yes, and it perpetuates the privilege. It doesn't allow for alternative perspectives on how you might demonstrate learning outcomes, how you might demonstrate that you've met particular standards. And so I think Jan is very much about, well, we need to move away from just having that dominant perspective and to think about what else can be supported. And to do this, it really is about inviting people into the conversations rather than just continuing to operate as we always have. So actually asking students, asking other stakeholders, what do you actually need, what would people need to do in this world? And I think a lot of the time we might think about that ivory tower kind of model, like a lot of academics perhaps have been doing the same things for a long time and they sit in this protected world, but always going out and understanding what's out there right now, what's important, what does industry expect of us is part of that.
I think there's an in-person question with the roving mic.
Yeah. Going back to the issues of greatest challenges, I'd like to comment on institutional policies and cultures, which I think is the elephant in the room here. And I would like to link it back to the panel at least a couple of panelists mentioned specific requests, which is that we make different forms of assessment available for a given unit of learning. Maybe one student wants to take the exam, the other wants to write an essay. I work at UCC, that would never be allowed. That's simply out of question. Another example, I would occasionally consider running an oral exam for my students rather than asking them to write an essay or do a written exam. That probably wouldn't be allowed either, because the institutional policy is that oral exams have to be assessed by a couple of people, so that has obvious workload implications. So this is the wall which I think 3/4 of us are hitting against. And unless we address that, well, certain forms of progress will be impossible.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm always curious to find out what is happening and what is that culture of assessment in a particular context. And your comments about oral assessment were interesting. I've been talking to colleagues elsewhere and doing research, so with Finland and Spain, and the oral assessment apparently is the predominant accommodation in some contexts, because that's just what they do. And so, really questioning why is and there's two bits. There's the policy. Why is the policy set in a particular way that prevents particular things? What are the good reasons for it being that way? And the other bit is about the culture, about what we do around here. And sometimes financial incentive to change things is really impactful. I know at my institution, they realised how much money it costs to run in-person invigilated exams. And they looked at the alternative and they went, well, nobody gets to run an in-person invigilated exam unless you have a special exemption for why you have to run an in-person invigilated exam because of the cost of it. And acknowledging that moving away from those things and towards other forms of assessment also potentially increases the workload for academics, because a lot of things that were previously taken care of by the exams team are no longer taken care of by the exams team. You actually have to mark your assessment yourself rather than running the multiple choice question exam sheet through the machine that reads the answers for you. So there are trade-offs there too. But I think it is always important to question why are the things done in a particular way, and is there a good reason for that? And thinking about that bigger picture and perhaps being strategic about where you choose to push.
If I might add to that as well, I totally agree with the last comment, and I think for me one of the key messages from Joanna's presentation for me is the need for collaboration at the highest levels around this topic. It's one of the big sort of drivers that led the cross-sectoral development of the Altitude Charter, which essentially is trying to place the topic of universal design at the strategic level of our institutions and to really encourage collaborative effort across the 4 pillars of the Charter, which teaching and learning assessment is just one, but also the support services, the digital environment, the physical environment. Because if we don't have that shared understanding of the needs and the challenges across all areas of our campus, and don't have that dialogue at the strategic level, then I don't think we'll only just be teetering around and fiddling around the edges if we don't actually do that. So I'm hopeful that people will have a look at that and really get behind it and try to encourage this much more strategic shift in how we think about these things moving forward. So it's not individuals trying to push against something that, trying to push a boulder up a hill.